Good. Well, my name is Keel Majewski. I work with Together We Remember, and I am coming to you from Kickapoo, Peoria, Sauk and Meskwaki, Ho-Chunk, Miami, and Sioux Land, now presently known by most people as Madison, Wisconsin. And we are in the 21st hour of this 24-hour vigil. We've been all around the globe, remembering genocides in every hemisphere. And now we want to take a look at our own history in the USA a little deeper. And I can say that when David and I visited Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum and National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama in 2018, we both recognized clearly that mass incarceration is a legacy of mass atrocity in this land, which has never been sufficiently addressed, and that the disparities that beset Black communities throughout the United States are a legacy of trauma and terrorism constituting genocide. For me, it's a clear case. The only question is, how did we get here? And that's what we're gonna look at in this session. We're gonna talk about the history and legacy of racial terrorism in the USA. We have a great panel, which means we're gonna have a jam-packed discussion, but we want your questions. So please enter them in the Facebook live stream, and we'll do our best to save time at the end if we can get to them. And now I want to ask the Reverend Dr. Al Hathaway of Union Baptist Church in Baltimore, Maryland, to open our session with an invocation prayer.
Yes, we will. Let us pray. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far along the way, thou who hast led us through the light, by thy might, may we never stray from the way. Oh God, we thank you for the blessing of community where persons of kindred minds and spirits can join together for justice. Justice in such a way that it will roll down like a mighty stream. We pray now for a community that will understand the humanity that everyone is made uniquely by you, oh God. We pray also for a feeling of sensitivity to need so that the last, the least, and the lost and the left out find place in your heavenly abode. May we, your people, be responsive to those needs. May we, your people, be advocates for truth and for justice. May we, your people, understand this grand mosaic of humanity that knits us all together, unites us under one DNA, but also keeps us centered and focused on our designated assignment to love, to care, to be concerned, but also to improve the lot of our fellow man. In your name we pray, amen.
Amen. Dr. Hathaway, thank you so much. I invite you to stick around and be with us on this panel. And we'll certainly look forward to your participation as well, okay?
Yes.
All right, thank you, sir. And sometimes it takes artists and poets to help us feel with our hearts and see with our higher minds, which we certainly want to do here today. So I want to invite Tank from the Grammy-nominated group Tank and the Bangas to come on screen and offer us a poetic invocation to set the stage for our conversation this evening.
I love Black folk. Black look like it's a different world. Sound like a crawfish ball in New Orleans and got friends from living single. Black folk joke around like Martin and got paintings from JJ in the living room. Black sound strong, look like sacrifice. It be flowers blooming, feel like summertime. Sound like old songs, smell like good food, and it tastes like heart disease, but it's spilled like maize at Jazz Fest. Black sound like something that hurt, like a hard test. Black sound like skin, like something dark. It sound like and look like hair. Black sound like rough hair and good hair. Sound like rape, look like history, like spiritual. Black sound like years, like working, like night. Black sound like money. It look like Walmart, like corner store, like cash registers singing. Black sound like 400 or 500 years. Smells like Oprah. Got a booty like Serena and look like Cicely Tyson. Sing like Nina Simone and feel like broken homes in Section 8. It smell like crack and collard greens. Sounds motivational. Feels like church, like big Sunday hats and ribbons. Sound like thick plaits swinging and sneaky uncles. Look like Tyler Perry making money. Sound like hating. Feel frustrated, don't it? Look like they don't get it, huh? Like they'll never ever get it, huh? Like push your personal feelings of racial injustice so far underneath the carpet that whoops, you trip all over your own family history. But I love Black folk. I love the hair grease and the rental fees, the front row seats, the police, the projects, mustard greens, being late, social security checks, government assistance, bougie, black looking good, bags of hair, fake press on nails, red tail stunting, gold teeth, gold chain, black men and big feet. I love me some Black folk. They are the people that were made from the darkest parts of the sky, part man, part God. Of course, they'd get lost on the way to the impossible place from which they came, distracted by dangles, gold and mines, smoke and things that shine and shimmer, throws that remind them of home, a place that be of embers. But I pray that the compass that leads the way isn't broken and we can all return home, because I just love me some Black folk.
Tang, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you. Just like Dr. Hathaway, we want to invite you to stick around if you're able to participate in our conversation. And are you able to stick around? And if not, we want to give you the opportunity to just say a couple words of personal reflection if you want to.
I would have to leave because my mom is waiting on me, but this is going to be so amazing. I just never thought that I would be a part of something like this in a time like this with people like yourselves. I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to recite my poem that I wrote. I just, when I wrote it, I didn't think that I would recite it like this or in front of you guys, in front of the world. So thank you for the opportunity, and I really just hope that someone that it opened their eyes to, what I see in my Black experience.
Well, thank you. We're very, very grateful for you blessing our session here with your creative inspiration, and please give our regards and blessings to your mother as well.
Yes, I will. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And now I just want to mention the other folks who are going to be on our panel, just so everybody has a sense of where we're going, and then we're going to get real quick into some historical grounding. So we've got Will Schwartz, president of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. We've got Terry Ward, associated with the Facing Injustice Project in Terre Haute, Indiana. And we got Lewis Lee from the Milwaukee Fatherhood Initiative, a number of community organizations. He's a shared studios portal curator in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we're going to get into a good discussion with those folks. But now, first, I want to turn to Gabrielle Daniels from Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. And Gabrielle, would you please introduce yourself and tell us your role with Equal Justice Initiative?
Hi, yes, just a pleasure to be here, and just want to, even before I introduce myself, just say that I really appreciated the complexity that Tank was naming in her poetry. And so as far as I am concerned, again, my name is Gabrielle Daniels. I'm a project manager at the Equal Justice Initiative. I do a lot with our research, our public education, and community outreach. And my guess is that a lot of people are familiar with EJI, but for people who may not be or might just be less familiar, we are a legal nonprofit based here in Montgomery, Alabama. And we particularly focus on issues of racial injustice and mass incarceration and the death penalty throughout our state, but also across the nation. And we have really been focused on trying to create a more in-depth and truthful understanding of the history of racial injustice and economic injustice in America, and how there's a continuity and a through line from enslavement that was started well over 400 years ago to today, and that if we aren't seeing that through line and that continuity clearly, we're not going to be able to make the kind of progress we need to make in the area of racial justice.
Okay, thank you. And Gabrielle, I just wanted to check real quick. We had discussed maybe the potential for slides. Are we going slides or no?
Yeah, no, not today.
Just fine, just fine. So Gabrielle, one of the central concepts that EJI has done a huge amount of research on is the concept of racial terror lynchings. So maybe we can start there. If you could just provide us with a definition of racial terror lynching according to EJI.
Yeah, so, when we're thinking of this conversation about racial injustice, a deep part of that racial injustice has had to do with sustained racial violence against Black people and particularly communities of colors. But communities of color. But what we've seen, especially when we're looking at the history of racial injustice in America, is that there are very distinct legacies of injustice and violence. And what we have tried to do is go back and document how you can begin with the era of enslavement of African peoples and African descendant peoples and track that through the history of the transatlantic slave trade, the domestic slave trade here in America, the end of the Civil War, which ostensibly should have ended enslavement of Black people, but really suffered from a lack of enforcement around what did it mean to be free and what did it mean to have guaranteed rights of citizenry and various forms of access. And so you end up with this period that is often referred to as Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, and there's massive violence, white resistance against the equality of Black people that leads to massive violence during that time period. And then when you're leaving that time period around 1877, what you start to see is a transition where Northern troops who had been in the South to defend what was happening as far as trying to advance civil rights for Black people leave the South. The South recreates itself, recreates its policies, starts to institute Jim Crow segregation, and you begin to see the increasing use of what we call racial terror lynchings to subject Black people to that segregation and to the various forms of exploitation. So specifically, when we refer to racial terror lynchings, we are talking about experiences where a Black victim was targeted by a white mob of at least 3 or more individuals and was killed in various forms of violence. Very often when people hear about lynching, they sort of automatically think about hanging, often in association with maybe accusation of crime. But lynching was much broader than that. Lynching could include hanging, of course, but also being shot to death, being brutalized, being burned alive, forcibly drowned. We've seen all kinds of situations of violence that were carried out at the hands of white mobs. And we specifically didn't just call them lynchings, but we really wanted to highlight the necessity of calling them racial terror lynchings, because the lynchings themselves, they were not just meant to target the one individual or multiple individuals who were killed in these incidents, but they were meant to terrorize the entire African American community. So if you can imagine, you have maybe one individual or even honestly entire pockets of a community who were killed sometimes through mass lynchings that would take place. And those racial terror lynchings, they didn't just happen in a vacuum. The experiences of finding the bodies of lynched Black individuals in the community, the experience of knowing that you're still living in the community with white perpetrators who are not held accountable. That's another feature of the definition, is that these mobs who were committing these racial terror lynchings, they were not held accountable by local officials or state officials or federal officials. So you don't have the guarantee of equal protection under the law. You don't have a sense of what did it mean to feel like you could actually escape this kind of violence for the Black community. So that kind of terror was very pervasive, and it was very effective as far as it contributed to the control of Black populations, and also contributed to the great migration of Black people from the American South when over 6 million Black people fled to the North, not just looking for economic opportunities, but also to flee this racial terror violence that was happening.
Right, and I read so much of what you're saying is can also be found in EJI's report, Lynching in America, which is available online. David and Marcus, maybe you can find the link and drop it in the Facebook live stream comments. But one thing that I remember reading from that report too, Gabrielle, was that the people who were migrating from the American South were often arriving resembling more like refugees fleeing war or genocide. So tell us then how this era of racial terror lynchings became enmeshed with the criminal justice system as we know it today.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. It's true, and it's an important point because often here in America, especially, America has its own characterizations of when it experiences what. And so you start to see in 2011 this conversation around domestic terrorism. But when you look at the period of time from 1877 to 1950, we as an organization were able to document well over 4,400 plus victims of racial terror and lynching here in America over just 7 decades. And so the scope of how pervasive racial terror and lynching was in America, it constituted domestic terror on a scale that we really have not acknowledged. And so you're right in the sense that when Black people who are leaving the South are fleeing to the North, they are really going looking for refuge. They are fleeing as refugees. They are internally displaced people. And so when you're looking at this context of what did it mean to be Black in America during that time period, you're grappling with a lot of different issues. Some of the factors, especially too, that we were seeing during that era that contributes to the question of how does it today connect to issues of mass incarceration and capital punishment, is when you start to look at the evolution of the use of racial terror and lynching, you start to see some patterns. One of the things that we predominantly found was that, when it comes to assumptions around who was lynched, you really see that it was more than just Black men who were targeted. So women were often also victims of racial terror and lynching, clearly not on the same scale as Black men, but were often more prominently featured than was previously thought. You see children who were victims of racial terror and lynching. Entire families sometimes were killed at the same time, communities driven out and displacement. So you have a lot that's happening that's changing Southern demographics and Northern demographics very rapidly. Further, what we see is the kind of use of racial terror to actually suppress things like political engagement or economic experiences and economic opportunities was also a primary feature. Very often, like I said earlier, people are thinking of lynching through the lens of, oh, well, this person was accused of a crime and it's frontier justice. But racial terror lynching was not frontier justice. It was a tool, a systematic tool for racial control that was allowed by local white officials, state officials, and was how do I say? It created an environment where if you were trying to actually navigate the racial boundaries that were already in place, a white mob didn't actually need any specific reason to lynch you. So you had examples where we documented one woman who was just walking on her way home one afternoon. She was in Jefferson County here in Alabama, in Birmingham area, and she was walking home. She was a school teacher in the area, and some white children started throwing rocks at her, and she scolded them. That was the extent of her interaction. But by the time she went home, those white children went and told their parents what had happened, and that was more than what they could tolerate as far as a Black woman scolding their white children. So that white community actually formed a mob, came and got this woman, her name was Elizabeth Lawrence, came and got her, removed her from her home, burned her home, and lynched her. So when we're talking about racial terror and this kind of domestic violence, we're not just talking about some of the sort of fringe violent activity that we sometimes associate with lynching. We're talking about socialized violence. We're talking about the use of terror in a way that entire generations of Black families suffered from that. Further, when it did come to things like accusation of crime, very often that was predicated by what we talk about as a presumption of guilt. This assignment of dangerousness that was contributed to Black people, that was very much so deeply born out of this narrative of racial difference, that idea of white supremacy versus Black inferiority. And you see this presumption of guilt developing that allowed pretty much any Black person, when a crime was discovered or suspected, could become a target for a white mob. So you didn't have to have a trial. You didn't even have to have associated evidence trying to tie you to the offense. But if you were in a situation where you would be suspected, and if you were proximate enough to where the violence took place or where the circumstance took place, you could be very easily abducted out of police custody, abducted from a jail, abducted from a courtroom, and lynched by this mob. And so when we're even thinking about how the criminal justice system was essentially failing in its obligation to protect Black people, and to do that in a way that was constitutionally required, what you're looking at is not just a communal failure, but a criminal justice failure combined. So by the time you start looking at the end of that era, and there are a number of other patterns, and Keela, I welcome you to help me, name all the things that would be valuable. But by the time you start to look at the end of this era, you're getting towards World War II. You're starting to see a lot of, basically the United States is criticizing Nazi Germany for what they're doing in the Holocaust. And of course, that was evil, so yes. But at the same time, you're a nation criticizing another nation that is committing the Holocaust while your citizens are lynching your Black citizens. So the kind of disparity, the hypocrisy that's happening began to attract international attention. And that poor international attention, coupled with increasing federal pressures, particularly on southern states, to do away with outdoor public spectacle lynchings. And for people who might not be familiar with that language, these public spectacle lynchings, they were not just the idea that maybe a couple of Klansmen come and abduct someone and lynch them. You're talking about entire communities. So you're talking about cities, you're talking about neighboring cities where hundreds and thousands of white people living in those areas would come to lynchings and treat them almost like they were a carnival experience. You would have food vendors, you would have postcards that were made. People actually take photographs and they were turned into postcards and mailed across the United States. You would have features where people would take souvenirs from the lynching victims after they were killed. And so when you're thinking again about what is happening in the American development, what is happening in the mind of people, not just in the Black community, but also in the white community, the kind of trauma, mass trauma that's happening, even if communities aren't acknowledging that. For example, white communities that aren't acknowledging that when they're bringing their children to lynchings, to watch lynchings. But at the same time, these public outdoor spectacle lynchings were creating a lot of bad press for southern states. So the South essentially decides, okay, we're going to start actually creating some accountability for these public spectacle lynchings and lynchings in general. And we're going to really urge our populations to stop lynching, but we're going to take it in a different direction. Instead of someone who is accused of a crime being carried out by a mob and being killed that way, we're going to ask that our populations allow that Black person instead to be brought into the courtroom. We'll give them a trial, we'll still find them guilty, and we'll be able to give them the death penalty that way. And then we can give them a legal execution, and no one can question us because it's all happened through the court system. So actually what you see is not just an abrupt end to lynching because, it's the right thing to do. Certainly, you don't see that. But you actually see this transition where you see a decrease in the use of outdoor public spectacle lynching and the increased use of capital punishment, essentially carrying out the same forms of violent vengeance from the white community. And what we find today even is that the presumptions of guilt and the assignments of dangerousness are still with us today. Cases of police brutality, false accusations that are made against Black people, the over-policing of Black communities, all of these issues grow out of that presumption in that era. The same way that the presumptions of innocence that are assigned to white officers who kill unarmed Black people, that too grows out of this era. And again, the lack of accountability for white mobs and the failure of law enforcement to protect Black people in their custody. And then, too, when you're looking at capital punishment specifically, we still find today that the states that had the highest rates of lynching still today have the highest rates of capital punishment, and Black people are disproportionately burdened by death penalty sentences here in America. So there are some really, there's some very specific points of continuity between these histories. But if you don't know that history, if you don't know those connection points, it's very easy to live in a space where you think that the criminal justice system is functioning as it should be, that only bad people end up on death row or in jails and prisons, and that there's just really an issue of crime in the Black community without understanding all of these other historical, let alone contemporary practices.
Sure, sure. And just a couple points that spin off of what you were mentioning when you mentioned the Holocaust, for example. I think a lot of people in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies would be surprised to learn that the United States did not ratify the UN Convention on Genocide until the 1980s, because Southern senators were concerned that they would be held to the same standard of justice vis-a-vis their treatment of Black people in America. And it wasn't until this year that a federal anti-lynching law was passed, finally, year 2020. And so you're talking about, because people don't know this history, tell us then why, with all the work that EJI has done in the criminal justice system and with research and reporting, why establish a memorial, a cultural site where people can come and tour?
Yeah, no, and I so appreciate those 2 points that you named. There's so much history that's involved. And I think when we were really starting to look at what does it mean to understand that there's so much history missing in the collective memory of America. You have entire curriculums that maybe have used textbooks that maybe have a paragraph in them about an era that lasted over 7 decades, that lynching is just whittled down to a very small subset of what has happened in American history. And you end up with a populace that, for a variety of reasons, apart from being very intentional, would not really know what happened between the end of the Civil War and present day America. So you have people saying things like, well, slavery happened a long time ago. Why are we still talking about that? Or, you mentioned Reconstruction and people are like, well, what is that? And what happened there? No idea. And so what we really began to see, and especially too, one of the important things to know both about our organization as a legal organization and about the work that we started to do in the space of historical narrative work and memory work was that the historical work and the narrative memory work directly grew out of our client support. When we were working with clients for over the past 30 years and seeing the ways that the same narratives of racial difference and racial bias, the same poor mistreatment of Black people in our criminal justice system was playing out over and over and over again for our clients. And we were only making so much traction inside of the courtroom where it really started to become a conversation around what does it look like to also help educate the community so that they can understand more specifically and more intentionally why these issues are happening. One, that they are happening, and then two, how do you understand them in the context of our national history? So as we were doing that historical research, our first approach was to publish reports. We did a documented study looking at the domestic slave trade in Montgomery, and from that, what domestic slavery meant across the nation. Most people are very familiar with the transatlantic slave trade, but not really with this period of domestic slavery after the end of the transatlantic slave trade forward until the Civil War. So we were looking at that and examining the legacies and the real injustices of that around that narrative of racial difference. And then from there, we started doing much more research on lynching in America and that documentation process. And when we released that report in 2015, there was a huge response to that. People wanted to know a lot more information about the era, about the time period. But specifically too, what we were starting to see was that a lot of people were really interested in knowing, well, what happened in my own community? Where I live, has a lynching taken place here? And we really understood even more clearly that because not only there is this lack of collective memory happening, but also because there has not been a very robust, intentional effort to document that history and actually build it into the built environment of communities. You have people living in communities and can live there for years, have no idea that these events took place, unless maybe they happen to encounter someone who knows something about the history. And we just don't believe that that's right. We don't believe that you should be in a place and go to a place where a racial terror lynching took place and not know that happened. Those events changed entire trajectories of communities at times. There have been communities where one racial terror lynching entirely drove out the Black community, and that community today is still predominantly white. And if you don't understand that, then you would have really no historical grid for understanding, well, why don't I live around a lot of other Black people? And so when we're thinking about what does it mean to actually help create social consciousness and collective memory, you have to actually build it into the community. You have to actually build it into the physical structures that will lend themselves to remembrance. So we began by trying to think through, well, what does it look like to do that? And that process allowed us to begin with looking at the role that historical markers could play. And so we started to work with some community partners in various places to install these historical markers, one, to see if we could, but then two, to try to see and get a sense of, well, you know, how would a community respond to a marker, and especially after learning that that history took place there. And what we found was that there were really positive, robust responses where people wanted to actually be able to break through and confront the silence that had been happening in their communities. People wanted an opportunity to talk honestly about the histories of racial injustice that were happening, and they wanted to do that in a way that actually demonstrated a commitment to long-term truth-telling that those markers represented. And so we were doing that work. We began with other forms of physical representative projects, such as soil collections. If people aren't familiar with soil collection projects, it was an opportunity where community members could go to the sites where we could best approximate that lynchings took place, and they could collect dirt from those areas and place them in clear glass jars that had a label with the person's name and the date of their death on it. And it was a really important opportunity for that person to be spatially in that location and to have to reflect on, what did it mean for this to happen here? What does it reflect about this community? And whether I'm a part of this community or not a part of this community, what does it say to me about my responsibility as it relates to racial justice in our nation? And those are very powerful, moving events. And as we continue to move forward, there was a very strong sense that we needed to do more and to actually help concretize, create cultural spaces that would allow people to come and have immersive experiences where they got to see that historical through line from enslavement to the failures of Reconstruction, to the era of racial terror lynching, to ending segregation and resistance to that, and onward, so that people could come and actually experience that for themselves. And so that led to the development of the Legacy Museum here in Montgomery, as well as its companion memorial, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, where those 4,400 plus victims are memorialized each by name.
Okay, Gabrielle, thank you so much. I'm really grateful that EJI has been so diligent about documenting and sharing its research findings, because everything you said in there, I mean, there's, you know, each sentence is another chapter that has layers and layers in it. And a lot of this can be found on Equal Justice Initiative's website. And I, you know, just so that our other panelists know the game plan here, we went probably 10 minutes over time, but it's because for us, I think it's so important to get that grounding in the historical context, because it informs the rest of the discussion. Gabrielle, we'll hope you can stick around for the rest of the panel. And I actually want to switch the game plan a little bit here and go to Terry first, and then Will, because Will, the Maryland project, is probably a little bit farther along in terms of its progression with the EJI Community Remembrance Framework. So Terry, if you could go ahead and unmute yourself, or Marcus, there we go. Terry, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you okay.
Good. Well, Terry, first of all, could you just tell us, introduce yourself, tell us where you're coming from, and what is your affiliation to the Facing Injustice Project in Terre Haute, Indiana?
Yeah, the Facing Injustice, first of all, Terry Ward. I reside in California. I'm presently in Las Vegas. Check on my son who's here. I came last night, so when you were talking to me yesterday, I was on the road.
No problem.
How did I get involved with the Equal Justice Initiative? First of all, I had visited the museum. I was in the South, coming from the North and living in the North, I was always told never to go to the South. So I very, very, very few times went. And this was one of the times when I went to the museum. First of all, I have to say, George Ward was my great-grandfather. He was lynched in Terre Haute. And we didn't know much about him during the years because the family never talked about it. But I often wondered, where did the men go in our family as soon as they were old enough to leave? And matter of fact, they even sent me away when I was old enough to leave to go to the military. So after I went to the museum and saw that there was a memorial for him, I wanted to know more about it within my community. I lived in the area almost all my life, but still never knew much about what happened with him, what happened to my grandfather, and what happened to my great-grandfather. And coming to the realization that my grandfather moved away from Terre Haute because he was the son of George Ward. And he had to leave the area because the stigma of the Ward name carried such an atrocity from what he was accused of that almost everybody who could leave would leave. And so I just wanted to get involved in it. I just wanted to know more about our family. Well, and then when you start to look at your family, you realize, for me, I was able to escape. I became pretty economically sound, but I look back at my family and I was the first generation after 3 generations that was able to excel economically. Every generation before me were poor people. And mostly everybody who had ever had any run-in with the last name Ward, who was Black in Indiana, always was adjudicated the worst type of punishment they could receive when they were, if they had done something wrong or if they were accused of something. So I realized that it continued from George Ward, it continued in every generation. And I am also a grandfather of a grandson who is presently in prison for 180 years for something that he didn't do. And so I want to know as much information as I can to see how things have happened and how they have moved forward as far as trying to make things right amongst people who actually have come up with less in most cases and have been always treated worse than anybody else. I am a mixed man, so I haven't experienced what my children have and what my grandchildren have. And so, but as I have seen them grow and seen the situations that they have been involved in with the justice system, I realize that they've all been given a treatment that's not fair compared to what the whites have received in that particular area. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, well, Terry, thank you for opening up and sharing that with us. You mentioned so many complicated legacies of the trauma of what happened February 26, 1901, to your great-grandfather, George Ward, in Terre Haute, Indiana. I'm so sorry to hear about the situation with your grandson. Me saying sorry would never, remedy the situation, but really appreciate you working with us in partnership on the Facing Injustice project in Terre Haute. And we were together in Terre Haute on March 1st for a soil collection with Gabrielle. David was there as well, and Marcus. Can you tell us just your reflection of that event, the soil collection that took place on March 1st in Terre Haute?
Well, the soil collection was a heart-touching situation. We had seen some pictures, but not many. We had heard about the 100 years of lynching in which our great-grandfather was in that. But me and my brother and the NAACP president, Sylvester, after Indiana State had found the proper location or the other approximate location that was closest to the site because the old bridge had been torn down, we traveled down over there to the bridge area and down the hill to collect the soil from the area. And what it made me feel like was that finally we can have some opportunity to put him to rest. No, we didn't get the exact dirt from him, but we did get the soil from that particular area in which it's going to the EGI Museum, the Historical Museum in Terre Haute, and then we have some that we're going to give him a proper burial that he never received.
Yeah.
Keel, am I still with you?
Yeah, you are, and I'm
Okay.
just showing here, Terry, some pictures from the soil collection. I don't know if you can see them or not, but
Yes, I can see that.
Yep, we're showing Ronald, we're showing the Wabash River there, and there's you and
And
Gene.
so to let the history be known, I even had my grandson there, one of my great grandchildren there, because if I never knew the story, they would have never known the story. And that doesn't make it okay, because the stories that we have in this life is what helps us move forward past the atrocities, the injustices, and understand what we must do to succeed in society. And so with my brothers there, it was a closure, and it was a bringing the fact that we're trying to exonerate his name gives us some dignity about ourselves, because we've always been accused of being rapists, murderers, thieves, and that's just not who we are. And so that brought that all into the thinking and the feelings of we were better than that, and he was better than what he was accused of. Now, I must say, in the process of this, the injustice was to him because he was a Black man, but it was also an injustice to the woman who died, because they never found out who murdered her. And to this day, it bothers me to think that he was accused, but it also bothers me to think that someone else lost their life and they never got due process of the law for them too. So I hope that's answering your question, Kia.
Yeah, Terry. Well, I thank you so much for being willing to channel, all of this that you have to process into something like this EJI project. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to get to work alongside you. And now I want to turn to Will Schwartz, who's the president of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, because Will, just in a few minutes, if I understand correctly, your project now has gone to the extent of establishing a state-level Truth and Reconciliation Commission on lynchings in Maryland. Is that correct?
Yes, one of the things that I think people in our state can be really proud of is that Maryland is the first state in the country to actually establish its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission for lynching, just about lynching. And we also have the benefit that Sherilyn Eiffel lives here, so we've been able to tap into her wisdom on occasion. She's actually met with us last month rather. Because we're really working on the protocol now for how the public hearings are going to go.
And Will, could you just maybe tell us a couple words about your motivation for getting involved in this project?
Well, we were very much tied in with Brian Stevenson's work. I mean, in fact, if I could just take a little bit of a detour. When Brian was on the book tour for Just Mercy, it had just been published, I guess, 4 years ago or so, something like that. A friend of mine who is a public defender actually in Baltimore told me that this Brian Stevenson's coming up. He's like a rock star in that world. I hadn't heard of him. His book was just published, so this guy gives great book recommendations, so I took his word on it, and read the book, and it's life altering. I don't need to tell anyone probably in this group here. So we went to see him, and in the course of his book talk, he mentioned the Lynching in America report that Gabrielle referred to, and it had just been published, I think, or it was the first iteration of that report, and I just was blown away. I mean, I shouldn't be proud of this, but I really, as Gabrielle was describing, I had no idea. I mean, no idea. When I was growing up, we knew lynching occurred, but it was like she said, it was a parenthetic remark. It was very antiseptic in terms of the imagery that one had. It was a noose swinging on a black and white cowboy film, right, kind of thing. It was not given any attention at all. So that was a real eye opener for me. And the report, as Brian described it that evening, the first iteration, and Gabrielle, correct me if I'm wrong, but it really dealt mostly with I think it was the 11 Confederate states plus Kentucky, right? The 12 states where most of this occurred. So I am a filmmaker in my real life. And I thought, someone has got to be doing this work in Maryland. so I attempted to find who might be doing that work, and I'm sure it says more about my failures as a researcher, but I couldn't find anyone who was doing it. So I mentioned this to another friend of mine who teaches history at a high school nearby, and he decided it might be an interesting project for his students. So for a better part of a year, I would go into his class once a week, and we would have Skype interviews. We interviewed Jonathan, I'm trying to remember, Kundina Mark. He's got that name that goes on to the next zip code, right? And I think Evan might have been on that call too. So we also interviewed people from, from all over the country. The man who is the head archivist at the Tuskegee University and so on. So it was a wonderful experience. And in the course of that experience, I learned about a lynching that happened a mile and a half away from me. I mean, right here. It's the old Baltimore County Jail, and it was converted into, it's now an office building, and I go by it every day. And actually, so I'm going to try and accelerate the story here because I know you don't have a lot of time. We did do, with Gabrielle's help, I might add, and I have to just say, Gabrielle, it's so nice to be able to spend time with you. I've known Gabrielle for like almost 3 years, and I've never had a chance to learn so much from you. So I'm enjoying it, and I appreciate it. So we did a soil collection there, and I've got a couple of things because there's a kind of an interesting story about this that I'd love to tell you about. So for, Howard Cooper is the name of the man who is, you can see this all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So this was the report in July, it was July 13th, 1885. He had been convicted of assault and rape, and he was awaiting he had already had a date for his execution set, but his lawyers were just about set to file an appeal with the Supreme Court because his 14th Amendment rights had been violated. Blacks were essentially barred from serving on juries in Maryland. So one just thing to note, I can see it right up here, is they waited till right after midnight because July 12th was a Sunday, and that was when they gathered, and they didn't want to lynch anyone on a Sunday, so they waited till after midnight, so it was Monday morning. Oh shoot, where is it go? So here were the scenes we did the soil collection, and it was an incredibly moving experience. And I wanted to that's the jail on the back, of course, this is, Gabrielle described the jars, and I'm sure everyone's seen it, and there they are on display there. So one thing I wanted to mention was that there was just go back up here. There's this woman back here. I don't know if you can see her.
We're only still seeing the newspaper clipping.
Oh, all right. So let's see. Oh, I'm not gonna bother with that then. I don't want to waste the time with that. Anyway, there was a woman there who was a public historian, and she was very interested in learning more about Howard Cooper and his family. And she was particularly upset that all of the newspaper accounts never mentioned his mother's name. And the story had it that after he was lynched, the next morning his mother had to come by and collect his body, and he's buried in an unmarked grave, not really too far from here either. But anyway, so here's why it is so important. I mean, there's a lot of things we can talk to here, but one of the reasons why this work is so important is this woman went and did some investigating of her own. Howard Cooper, in the press at the time, he was described anywhere between 19 and 24 years old. He was a brute. He was huge. She went to see what she could find out about him, and she found him in the 1870 census, and he was listed. He had a twin brother. He was listed along. He was living with his mother, an aunt, and his two grandparents. And this was he was lynched in 1885. In 1870, 15 years earlier, at the time that the census was taken, he was listed as being 6 months old. And that means that he couldn't have been any older than 15 years old at the time of his lynching. And it's just, it's beyond tragic, right? They're all, it's all tragic. But this just how somehow, I can't go by that building anymore and not think of his mother having to collect her child that morning. It's awful. So I don't know if that answers your question. I don't even remember what the question was, to tell you the truth.
Well, yeah, I appreciate you, Will, adding more, another layer of personal historical context there too, because that's ultimately what we're talking about. I mean, when we talk about the context of the Holocaust and numbers,
right,
we have to recognize that it's individuals and families and personal connections we're talking about.
It wasn't just, when I speak about these things, it's not just, it's not just the victims to whom we owe justice, right? It's their families, it's their neighbors, it's their communities who were terrorized, knowing that they could be the next, right? It's the people who did nothing.
Yeah.
We need to remember for them too. And if I could just, I know you want to get to other people here.
We're really tight on time, Will, so I do want to.
Okay, just go right ahead. I don't want to take any more time, but thank you for having me and for allowing me to be part of this.
Thank you, Will. Yeah, we really appreciate you being here. And Louis, I know we could go a full hour just with you, sir. If you could go ahead and unmute your mic. Louis, you and I have worked together on a few occasions. Louis, can you unmute yourself, please? Or else, there we go. Oh,
I hear you.
Okay, you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Louis, could you just introduce, we've got about 6 minutes left or so. And I'd love for you to just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the context you're working in and some of the initiatives that you're taking part in.
Well, my name is Louis Lee. I'm formerly the outreach coordinator for the Milwaukee Fatherhood Initiative. I'm actually this is a great topic for me because I'm actually an ex-convicted felon, so I know a lot about being in prison, the effects of prison, have to overcome being locked up. One of the places I live at is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in a community called the Amani community, which unfortunately right now is known for the most incarcerated community in the United States. I'm a mentor in that community. After going to prison, I decided to become a mentor, go back out, educate kids on criminal justice, which is my specialty, from like an inmate's perspective, but from also from being how can I say, a counselor, a teacher of criminal justice. One of the things I teach is nurturing fathers. I believe fatherhood is a way to kind of get back into the fight and educate so many inner city kids on incarceration because so many men are missing from the household. I'm from Milwaukee, like I said, a money community, which is known as the highest incarcerated zip code. And one of the things we do in Milwaukee with high incarceration rates being the problem is we try to educate as many young people as we can on what just laws is. So we started an organization called Made Men Worldwide, Research Home for Boys, where we kind of focus on going at young men because they're the ones that are affected mainly by the high incarceration rates and mass incarceration rates. And we decided to educate them on what criminal justice is. One of the many things we face in Wisconsin is people tend to cop out, meaning take pleas because they don't have, how can I say, finances to actually get good defenses. So what you have is a number of people who don't know the law, who aren't educated on laws, who are young, who go inside the prison system and just cop out in order to get home faster. That's what I did. I can only speak for myself. As I got into the prison, I started to understand what the prison system was doing, how it was affecting my family. So many other families, I know we're running short, so if you want to find out more about this whole thing, you can actually go to the Portals Policing Project on Google, Portals Policing Project, or Portals Shared Studios. Speaking of Portals, Portals is also a thing that we do here in Milwaukee where we take technology and educate kids on culture, and we use this technology also to talk to people around the United States about criminal justice. Milwaukee was a city that had an opportunity to actually be a part of a huge research with Yale University, Rutgers Law School on criminal justice, where people in the inner city felt the way about the way they were being policed, what they knew about the law, what we felt about so many unsolved crimes in our neighborhood that go on. And actually, even though being the most incarcerated zip code kind of is a bad thing, it actually became a savior because we were able to get people from outside and around the world to actually pay attention to the problem. So I know we run out of time. So with that being said, like I said, you can go to sharestudios.com, Portals Policing Project, Google it, find out more about Milwaukee. You also go to YouTube and look at a couple of trailers about an award-winning documentary called Milwaukee 53206. I repeat that, it's Milwaukee 53206, award-winning documentary about living in the most incarcerated community in the United States. And, I'm Lewis, and I just want to thank Together We Remember Dave and everybody for allowing me to participate today.
Well, thank you, Lewis. And what we saw basically is that we just need more time together, and we need more time to share all that we can learn from everybody who's on this panel. I want to thank you all for taking part in this. You know, one thing, if people want to get involved, you can always learn more. I mean, go to Equal Justice Initiative's website, read some of those reports, get informed, find local initiatives that are working on racial justice, reconciliation, those sorts of projects. Thank you very much, panelists. So long for now, racial justice panel. Hello, Charleston and South Carolina. I'm going to hand it over.